Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Art Forum. For those of you who don't know me, my name is David Sequeira, and I'm the director of the Margaret Lawrence Gallery, and I'm also the person that organises Art Forum for the Victorian College of the Arts. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to take a moment for all of us to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are situated right now. For most of us in southeastern Victoria, this is the land of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge that for many generations before the Faculty of Fine Art and Music was even considered, or any museum or any studios, that actually the traditional custodians of this land practiced the visual arts. They practiced song, dance, storytelling, and that these rituals continue today. And also to acknowledge that we don't take it lightly that we practice our arts on that land. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any First Nations people who are joining us from anywhere in the world today. Our guest speaker, Greg Creek. Greg's practice of large-scale narrative, allegorical and satirical painting, drawing and installation projects pose compelling questions about art history, politics, aesthetics, and the relevance of painting as a medium for contemporary practice. Greg uses a number of different graphic styles and mediums, representational and abstract rendered drawings, watercolours, diagrams, notations from everyday life, and collage, among so many others. The works often incorporate aspects of his process, such as spills and stains, and this excess of information seems to form an idiosyncratic philosophical narrative. Greg is studio lead in the drawing department at RMIT University's School of Art. Wherever you are, please make Greg welcome.
Thanks, David. Thanks for your warm welcome. And also, I did want to thank you for the acknowledgement of country you've made on all of our behalf. So, hi everyone, and look, it's a real privilege and a pleasure actually to be speaking to you today, particularly because we're all in this strange, lockdown situation. I'm sitting here in my home, but I've got a bit of virtual studio going on in the background, because normally when I'm doing other types of stuff in stage 3, I'd be sitting in my studio with that background, but I'm working from home. So I thought I should give some sort of sense of the virtual aspect of that. So thanks for coming along. What I will do, I will share my screen, and obviously I'll then go through my slideshow with you. I think we've got about 30 minutes, 35 minutes, so it's not going to be, a long, in-depth discussion. But I think we've also then got 15 minutes or so of questions following that, and David will moderate those questions, I believe. So I'm looking forward to that. We will see how we go. I'm going to look at a few things. I'm going to look at some early bodies of drawing works that I've done, which have produced a number of key ideas that I've been interested in. But I want to then segue to a more recent body of paintings that I'm still in the act of doing. And I have a bit of a handle on them, but because they're so fresh and they're so sort of in the act of coming into being right now, I'm not really going to claim to know fully what they're about. But what I am interested in is talking about how they come about, because that's one of the sort of aspects of making that I'm interested in. So let me share my screen. And I will go into my PowerPoint. Okay, I'll leave my video on up in your screen so you can see me looking at my notes and so on. This is standard screen. And I really haven't got a title, a complex title for the talk, other than just to label it paintings. At various times I had more words there and fewer words there, but I thought, no, I'll just settle on the end point where I'm going to land. A few things. This is just a shot of my studio. It's not currently my studio. It's my studio from maybe 4 weeks ago, I think. where I was doing certain works. And you'll see some of these things reappear as we go through. You might see aspects of this appear in a painting, or this, and so on and so on. One of the things that I did want to alert you to at the beginning was really about something that sits in my mind at the moment, and that is this, and I'll read it out, that central to viewing a painting for me at the moment is the notion of recoverability. That is, understanding that the making of the painting is coded into its final state and informs our reading of it. This idea that there's a history in the painting, that the painting does not have to hide that history or obscure it, but in various ways reveals that history so that the viewer perhaps can decode some of those makings, albeit perhaps in a sort of vicarious way, but nonetheless decode some of these makings and engage with the painting as an actual object. And because of that sort of thing, what I'd want to do is, like I mentioned, just concentrate a little bit on how these pictures and works are put together. And I'll show you some time-lapse sort of developmental photos later on. I did want to, though, start with just a couple of ideas. So I'm going to start quite a long way back. These are printed pamphlets and drawings of the guillotine images around Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette back in the 17th century in Paris. The reason why I wanted to start with these was just to point out, to compare these two to the second image that I'm going to do, to introduce these couple of ideas. A lot of the writing around, particularly these images and the idea of the killing of the king through the guillotine at the time, was that there was this symbolic decapitation as a sort of critical gesture against the king. And these images that we're looking at here, the pamphlet on the right and David's drawing of Marie Antoinette on her way to the Place Concorde where she was guillotined, sort of capture part of this. There's an idea that the status, the sort of representation of the body of the king, and in this instance as well the queen, standing in for the body politic of the whole community, is ruptured at this key time. And these photographs, or these prints, are a type of reportage. The reportage of the sort of image that was already there to some extent. And as I said, it's a type of iconoclasm, removal of the head of the individual, symbolic of the removal of the head of state. Now, I wanted to just compare that to these images of the King Louis Philippe from the 1830s that came later. And this is a sort of well-known image that was drawn by Charles Philippon in the 1830s, subsequently reproduced as a printed etching by, who was it done by? Daumier, sorry. But the interesting thing about this is that Philippon was jailed for these images that he produced. And of course, the interesting thing about the images is that it is sequences of 4 caricatures, or what we would now call caricatures. At the time, that concept wasn't quite as prevalent or well known as it is now. But these 4 caricatures of the head of the king transforming into a pear. And this was a pun in French at the time because it was a pear head. The same pun works for us. And so I'm interested in this, how it's different to the reportage of the previous drawing and how it seems to open up another type of gesture against the idea of the king, the idea of the sort of body of authority that was represented by the king. In this particular picture, it seems to me that, again, sent Philippon off to jail. It does seem to me that the viewer is complicit in the satire, and perhaps there is a power in such attitudinal or cynical gestures that are instituted in this drawing. And it's almost like the drawing generates a capacity to have internalized by the viewer seditious image thoughts. And I wonder if that at the end of the day was not the true sort of power of this image. It was not so much the fact that it pictured something that had occurred in society, as graphic as that image may be, of the king's head dismembered from his body, but this seemed to activate something else that was seen to be equally as dangerous, to produce the jailing of Philippon. And that seems to me, again, it seems to me it sets up this idea that we internalize potentially, or the viewers at the time obviously, but to some extent I think we still do it even now, 200 years later. We internalize the sort of fundamental image idea that the king can be transformed away from his authoritative state into a comic or dispersed bodily state. In this case, in Philippon's drawing, it's a mere few squiggle drawings, lines down in the bottom of the right corner that suggest this idea of a pear head. Maybe that's the bigger threat at the end of the day to the authorities of the state than even what the actual guillotining became. It's seditiousness. So that's one idea that I wanted to think about, which was how artworks, how paintings, how drawing processes actually communicate or internalize certain elements in the viewer. And this relationship between the artwork and the reception of the artwork by the viewer, or we might call it the encounter of the artwork by the viewer, is a really key thing that I've looked at, especially in my drawing projects, which I'm going to show you. And I'm trying to rethink through the current painting works, which we'll have a look at shortly as well. Okay, so the second idea that I wanted to put to you was the idea of the homunculus. The homunculus is ordinarily, in deeper time, back to medieval times, it's the idea of the little man, the model of the little figure that we all carry within us. In early medical texts, it was the idea of the fetus that sort of is accurately formed and then just gets bigger when it's born. But even in current times, it's an idea of the sort of cognitive map of our body that we carry with us. You can see on that sort of fragment of an image on the right I've got there, which is taken from some contemporary mappings. You know, in the scientific notion of the homunculus, we might have larger hands, a larger mouth, larger tongue, and so on. But it's this idea of a sort of, not idealized, but an internalized figure that we carry within us potentially. In particular, though, I'm interested in some of the writings that a French critic and theorist called Claude Gandelman raised up about the homunculus. And he put it in the context of political bodies, political situations. And I've put this quote here. I won't be reading many quotes off the screen, but I will read this one. That Gandelman said that behind any political philosophy or any political action, there's an image of a huge human body, which appears as a sort of watermark. So he's inverting it. He's saying that in the political, to some extent, the social context, that there is also an active notion of an homunculus that we register. But he's saying it's a huge scale, quite opposite to the smaller internalized notion that had existed previously. So Gandelman goes on to say that the pictorial and verbal productions of, let's call it, historical political discourse, seem to be superimposed over the image of this huge human body, or even the images of its organs and so on. And he compares this conjuring up of the huge political homunculus as a type of grotesque and distorted, what he calls a revolutionary homunculus. And so in a number of times when I was coming out of working with an interest in caricature, like I indicated in the earlier slides, and coming into thinking about some of my own work, I was interested in how this sort of conjuring of a larger body / state could be worked with, could be interrupted, could have gestures made against it, could be disordered, and could be reordered. I've got another comment I did want to make here. So there may be that this notion of the homunculus can be can be even embedded in a material way. The idea that we think against a larger political homunculus may be transferable through to even various parts of a painting or a work of art, not just the images that exist within it, but even the form of the artwork. Okay. So I'm going to show you, just briefly, a few earlier works that are drawing works that sort of tackled some of these ideas, or at least tried to activate some of these ideas and maybe induce a type of mirroring in the perception, in the mind, in the experience of the beholder of the work. This is a work called Chatter Shapes. It was produced for the Edinburgh International Festival in 2009 in Scotland. And it was constituted by a series of what I used to refer to as tabletop drawings or desktop drawings, but a sequence of long frieze-like drawing works on paper that were installed throughout the corridors of a essentially 18th century building that was the museum. Mixed media, as you can see, 9 sections, and these were installed on the walls, and there were various texts that at some stages could have been within the body of the drawing sheet or the ground of the sheet, but were moved out and placed on the wall as well. And as David said a bit earlier, these drawings are essentially made up of sort of the minutiae of thinking around issues. This is just another single version of the work that you'd seen in the previous slide, or the detail, the installation detail you had seen in the previous slide. So you get a sense of what the drawing here looks like. There are sort of mapped or schematic diagrams. In the middle, you can see that there's dark shapes, and these are body prints. They're actually prints of my inked up body, and they transform across to the right-hand side with various other texts and so on in watercolour drawings. I won't go into a lot of detail about the specific content, but it's enough to say there was a dialogue here between some of the geographical sort of landscape features in the city of Edinburgh and some back here in Melbourne. So there was a dialogue between two spaces across the world, conceived as a type of frieze. But what I wanted to concentrate on here was just the use of conjuring up the body. Again, like I said, through a inking up of my own self, and then that being printed onto a flat surface and then being worked into the body of this longer drawing. So there's a type of rotation happening as well. Some of these parts of the drawings feel like they get produced on a horizontal surface or plane, and then they're rotated up to a vertical plane to see them. So there's a sort of shift in vision as well. The drawings largely came from, again, alluding to what David said earlier, the bits and pieces that I had done as a type of visual research whilst I was in Edinburgh. And these are just some examples of work that had informed the Chatter Shapes finished work based in some of my sketchbooking from around the place. Some of these drawings were redrawn back into the larger work. Some of them were actually cut out of the sketchbook and brought back in. But you can see also the sort of range of materials that I was sourcing. And this background, if you like, activity of drawing has been part of my practice from the time I was at art school, and it served various functions. One as a background, a research activity, something that remains in a sketchbook, if you like, but at other key times it's been forefronted. And these 3 works I'm going to show you are about the forefronting of that drawing practice. This is the studio I was working in Edinburgh, and I put it in because I wanted to show you not only how messy I was trying to live in a room and use it as a studio at the same time, but to give you a sense of the idea of the dispersal of materials that were built into these works. These drawings have many different places, and the way they're put together, which I'm going to show you an example of in a minute, means that some parts of the drawing can exist in one part of the larger ground or paper ground, but they can be cut out and moved around. So here's an example. Here's a close-up of this section of chatter shapes. It was called Of Grotesque Economies. This particular 4-metre section had a sort of subtitle. And you can see these drawings. It's a bit hard to tell on your image here, and I'm not sure about the quality of your screen or even, you know, the sort of resolution that I'm projecting from here. But you can see it's a sort of collagic approach. But essentially this front surface of the drawing of the paper, unlike traditional collage, the front surface of this drawing is kept uniform, and it's the back sections of the drawing that actually get activated and overlapped at time. So that's a detail of the drawing from the front, and the back of that drawing looks like this. So you can see it's a sort of collage together, even a bandaged, repaired site. And I very much saw it as this rear view that obviously viewers of the work can't see, nonetheless does hold a presence in the front of the drawing. This reproduction or images are just been too well lit for me to show the ripples and the underneath tracing of the work. But in ordinary everyday lighting, you can pick up some of these aspects. And so my sort of hope was that the viewer, in looking at these works, were also conscious of the materiality of the drawing and the materiality of the site of the drawing as a constructed, put together, repaired sort of body, particularly in this case, the idea when it's actually imaging bits of the body, but when it's talking about a city as well. The work was sort of made like this. This is my studio in Northcote. You saw a previous image of it. This is how it is. And you can see here where the bits and pieces were brought back into Melbourne and the work was re-established. And on the table, I wanted to show you this is about where the drawing itself is overlapped onto itself. And that's so that I could cut through 2 layers of the drawing and then invert their relationship. And those weights and bits and pieces and books and things you can see on that piece of paper, they're weighing down the drawing as the bandages dry and secure the removed parts of the drawing within the paper ground. I wanted to show you these because they're going to reappear a bit later as well. Okay, so the second work I wanted to show you, there, of course, with all artists, there are other bodies of work that we've made, but I'm just going to try and concentrate on these 3 at the moment. This body of work called Bodies Politic was sort of an extension and a more specifically, if you like, political type of extension away from the methods that had built or produced chatter shapes and other similar works like that. So Body Politics, this is an image from Shepparton Regional Gallery from a few years ago. Body Politics was again a set of 8 body prints that I had done as a sort of foundational ground on which I could then work, pull apart, cut, remake, project onto, and so on, various other types of images and gestures, if you like. You can see in the descriptions of the work, it says about acrylic, graphite, transfer prints, paper tape. Parts of the drawings were sewn back together, and so on and so on. And they'll present it on these aluminium tables. The aluminium tables had actually come from some of the anatomy work that I do as a lecturer, as a drawing lecturer at RMIT, where I take students to an anatomy tables. And of course, in the classical anatomy room in an institution, the body itself is divided into what's called 8 continents. That's right, this is a very 18th century, 19th century imperialist view of the body itself. Interestingly, those continents on another level are divided into nations in this sort of view of the body, classical view of the body. So this, to some extent, mimics that. There are 8 tables and there are 8 bodies projected down into these tables. This is a view of how I worked generating the drawings in the studio that then went into here. Unfortunately, I don't have never got a installation view of somebody walking around the tables, but it was a key idea that these sort of 8 fragmented bodies, which are disordered in space and also within their own sort of arrangement on the page, could be reconnected by a viewer walking between the tables, going from one table to another, bending over, even touching the surface of the acrylic underneath which the drawings sit, and so on. So there was a sense of this splayed out or dispersed field of drawings could be reanimated by the body of the actual viewer. At the same time, they're looking at these figures, if you like, in the drawings themselves. I did want to point out in this image that you can see some other frame drawings on the benches there in the studio, and they're going to appear again a little bit later because they're other works that I was working on, and they will have a say in some of the paintings. So these are some details of the body's politic drawings, this suite of 8 table drawings, which you can see fragments of the print, and they have other stuff going on. There's graphite gesturing over parts of the drawings, and you'll also see some of these smaller print transfer heads that sort of appear. And even in this sense, there's a little sort of idea that these are almost like transformers, or a strange homunculus, strangely figured political body. Those little heads are the heads of various notorious heads of state from the 20th century. The grey areas in these images represent where part of the body of the drawing was rubbed through, was pulled out, ripped out. And when the drawings were installed, they were actually sandwiched between 2 sheets of acrylic. So when you were leaning over one of these drawings, like I'd shown in the early image, you could peer through to the ground, their actual absences in the drawing. The one on the right, on the extreme right, the one over on the left as well, has sewn thread that pulls together some of those gashes. So the surface of the drawing is really activated. It's quite material, albeit in this case, sandwiched and flattened between acrylic. And this is some, just a sort of rogues, sort of gallery of some of the types of heads that were put into as print transfers into those earlier drawings. Print transfer means that it's like a bubble jet print usually onto maybe an acrylic, and it can be rubbed off before it dries back into a printed surface. Ian Smith from Rhodesia is there, and so on. Okay. Another work I want to briefly talk to you about is one called Dog Whistlers. Again, with the implication in its title of the sort of subliminal messaging, or the targeted messaging that political figures often communicate underneath a generic type of messaging. We all, we're all very, very familiar and frightened, no doubt, by Trump and many of his messagings that he does. Many other politicians do it as well. This was an installation in Vienna, in an exhibition that I was in Vienna after a brief little residency. And in this instance, similar ideas had come out about the idea of different bodies of drawing. In this case, it's toilet paper. So there was a sort of ironic satirical aspect. There was disused toilet paper. And there were print transfers of all of the parliamentarians in the Austrian parliament. And they had been manipulated, just gently manipulated in Photoshop to exclude bits and pieces of what were really their sort of effigy shots, their sort of publicity shots that I ripped off from the Parliament site. I also made use of some elements that I'd used in a show in Melbourne, one of which was this dead dog's body, this desiccated dog's body that I had found under my back veranda out here. just not far from where I'm sitting now, when we'd pulled down an old part of the building, I'd found this dead dog's body. So it was sort of like a, well, sort of confronting presence in the show that on one way announced some of the motifs of the show, the idea of a dog whistler, how can you whistle to a dead dog, and so on and so on. But the real mechanism of the show was that these print transfer images of the whole swathe, 183, I think it was, Austrian politicians, were presented on walls. There were pens available, and visitors to the show could come and add text to the sort of basic speech bubbles that were playfully produced, that I cut into these swathes or these swatches representing each of the figures. So that in all of these, the body of the actual politician is absent. It's just the head and sometimes a bit of a sense of a tie or a shoulder. Again, like I said, there were exclusions. You can see over on the left, I would have cut the eyes out of that figure, but also there were digital manipulations beforehand, removing the hair and so on. And people who came to the show could then add, in this instance, usually in German, but they could add their own proposals for thoughts that these politicians might be thinking. So there's a mechanism, as if to say, let's try and add what we collectively might think are the real meanings or the real texts, the real dialogues that politicians are communicating to us, underneath, if you like, what their public messaging is. I think the one on the left in German says, I've got a small sexual member. The one on the second from the left, he became the Austrian Prime Minister not soon after, because this was just before the 2016 Austrian election. And you can see down the bottom on the two sort of drooping elements, somebody has written "no way" in English. The drawing third from the left, somebody's added the horns to that character, and there's writing in German on the woman on the right that I actually can't read. I did get them translated at some stage, but I don't have them. And to some extent, it really wasn't the point that I could understand them. What the point of that show was that the Austrian Viennese audience could hear and understand their own talkings, if you like, to themselves. So again, this was a bit of an idea of the body or the agency of the viewer interacting with the work. At the same time as everyone was engaged with this idea of the political homunculus. Who was the body that they're talking about? Whose body is being defaced? What is this idea that sort of the community carries around about these political figures? And I should say, you know, I'm not that cynical about political figures. The irony here is that our politicians ultimately represent us. And ultimately, on one level, they are ordinary people. What was marked by gathering together all 183 members of, in this case, the Austrian Parliament, was just how banal and how everyday and how actually unremarkable and unknowable all of these people were. En masse, there are all these heads and we barely knew who they were. The final image I just wanted to show you, coming out of that one, of course, was some of the other stuff that was happening in the real world outside of the gallery space at the very time that I had done this show. I was aware that, an election was coming up, and partly I had used this particular work that I had done a version of in Melbourne not long beforehand, but I used this, or remade, if you like, this particular work because I knew there was a context, a political context happening in Vienna. So these are some political posters where, of course, as we all know, in everyday culture, if you like, they get defaced. And so it was interesting that the chap on the left, he was the leader of the Tory party or the equivalent, was also getting horns and sort of demon beards, you know, sketched onto his face. Okay. So that was 3 drawing works where I attempted to work with the nature of drawing, the ground of drawing, the paper as a type of body, and really activating the body of the viewer in their engagement or encounter with this work as a way of sort of, not in a particularly sort of ideological political way, but in an everyday political way, to have people engage with their concepts and their own political judgments, and especially in the sense that we let politicians speak for us. As a bit of a segue, I did want to show you these drawings, which were really important for me, and I've been doing these sets of drawings, which are called Drawings for Love, Death and Politics, for several years. And they are almost like the type of individual drawing acts that I would have made that became part of the earlier desktop drawings, but they were pulled out and made into discrete drawings. So at the moment, there's about 100 of these, and I will continue to make these. They're a type of research, they're a type of graphic presence in their own right. David mentioned earlier about a wide range of approaches, and they plainly embody that. You can even see in this image, which there's an installation shot from Sarah Presents Gallery, where I had arrayed them in sort of a grid, closely packed with a whole range of stuff. And they're made at different times and in response to different things and so on. But I wanted to show you these because I began to use these as the basic units, if you like, or the basic bodies of imagery, which might inform a subsequent group of paintings, which I've currently moved on to and which I'm going to move on to in this talk. So bear in mind some of these images, and I'm going to show you some of these as I move on. So time-wise, let me just check everyone. Okay, so I've been going for 30 minutes. So I'm not going to spend too long, 35 minutes. I'll probably be finished in about 7 minutes, and then we can have a chat if that's all right, David. So I wanted to take you through these recent paintings and show them to you. The irony of all this, of course, is that these paintings have not been, well, they were exhibited at Sarah Scout, but a very limited amount of time. This is an image from a space at my studio where we can show works. So there's a certain sort of irony here where I'm showing you these paintings, and I'm really glad to be showing you these paintings because their audience in the moment of their display was, as many people have experienced with COVID-19 lockdown, the experience of these works was curtailed. And in fact, the irony here is that I had one opening lined up for the show, but it was cancelled back in April. And then when we thought we're all coming out of it, I had another opening lined up for these works in June or whenever it was, but that was cancelled as well, just prior to us going into stage 4 lockdown. So collectively, we're all here, and this is sort of like a pseudo opening again for these works. This is the original 4, but I'm making more of these, and I'm going to show you them as well. So I guess I'm hoping that you might reflect on some of the processes I've been making in the previous drawings and how they're playing out into the presence of these works as paintings. I've often had a question in my mind that's like a rhetorical question, and I don't actually quite have the answer to, although I have heard some people pose answers. And that question is, what is the difference between drawing and painting? And I've heard one example, one response that talks about the fundamental difference is the way that those two methods of making treat the ground on which they are made. To what extent they reveal the ground, to what extent they activate the ground of the paper, the ground of the canvas, and so on and so on, which is sort of an interesting idea, but I'm not sure whether it can be sustained very much. But an extension of that is how painting and drawing, and of course it's not oppositional, this is a false opposition, but nonetheless, for argument's sake, it might be interesting to think about how the ground, as it were, operates not so much for the maker, but how the ground of the painting or the drawing operates for the viewer. Here's a studio shot, and you can see there are similar methods. On the right-hand side, you can see that there's a body print. So I was bringing in some of these continued body prints as a type of inaccurate, not representation, but a type of inaccurate manifestation of the body or a figure into the works. Just an example of where the body prints occurred and how they happened. That's hanging on the wall, but obviously they occurred on a flat surface. And this became like a, wow, it's like a repository of forms that could be cut into paintings. And that's what I had been doing and what I did in these paintings. And I'm going to show you a little bit of this. Quite similar to the drawing works, elements of the paintings are cut into the surface of the linen. And this is, it's not a raw linen, it is a sized, it's a glued linen with a glue size, but it does not have an acrylic white ground put on it. So it sort of has a raw texture to it, and it has the color of raw linen. And these are weights in a workspace, again, near my studio, where I cut pieces out and cut them into the surface of the linen and then weigh them down overnight, so that when that whole, as you can see, that square of linen is turned back over front ways, the front leading edge of the painting is homogeneous. It has a flatness about it, rather than, like I said earlier, lined up as a type of 3 or low relief collage surface. The other thing about these paintings, I'm also using some other ways of generating images. And this is a very interesting set of choices for me. Rather than hand painting everything, it's enabling me to make certain types of choices about how and what the type of information is and how that information enters the painting. So I'm doing screen prints, and these are obviously an extension of the transfer prints. And you can see here just where I was setting up and registering some prints to go on a painting. What I wanted to do, again, if we've got enough time, David, I did want to take you, and it won't take long, to take you through a process of how these paintings were done. This is one called die-cast bride painting. I just want to take you through the sequence of these paintings to give you the experience, a sort of surrogate experience of what the material nature of this painting can, to some extent, reveal, or, as I put earlier, make recoverable to the viewer. So I'm going to take you through this sequence of how the painting was done. That's the body print cut into the surface of the painting prior to it being stretched. When it gets stretched, I take the roll of canvas over to the stretcher, they stretch it out, it gets a bit more taut than that. That's the back of the painting. So similar to the drawings, it shows you the sort of repaired site of the painting. Here we go, okay. And there's the final state of the painting. So that's just a bit of a cycle through how the painting was done. I mean, just as an aside, I do tend to keep lots of process images. I take lots of images of the work when I'm painting and when I'm assembling works, particularly with these paintings. I find it really, really valuable to be able to look at the pictures or the images later when I'm at home and not at the studio, and to see them recontextualized, usually because it's a different scale, it's on your phone or something, but it gives me this sort of the notion of a second look at what's going on, and helps me, interestingly, begin to formulate what the painting may need. And then those things occur in front of it. So I'm going to take you through, so we don't go too long, just through some of the sequence of paintings. This is called entoptic drowning painting. Wanted to show you some details so you've got a sense of the actual surface of the works. You can see on the left there's a little bit of three-dimensional rubbery material hanging on to the painting. That was a block out area where I rubbed it back. Again, a sense so that you can see that it's quite apparent where cutouts occurring. If you look at the left image down the bottom, you can see the two different weaves in the linen as they come together, sometimes overpainted or not. And the right image gives you a sense of what a printed, a silk screened surface of painting looks like underneath other, if you like, hand done painting. These are some of the source images. Again, they're drawings for Love, Death and Politics. The one on the left is wax on a found child's cardigan, and the one on the right is a collage of Tony Abbott, who's back in the news. You would think that we have had a look and sort of seen the end of him. This is another painting. Again, I'll zip through these to give you a sense. The size of these, as you can see, they're roughly 2 meters square. So the figures that you can see here, the skeleton figure, depending on where they are in the picture plane, if they're up front, close up, they will be nearly full size. And as they are structured and recede back into some of these planes or perspectival spaces, the scale changes. There's a pretty consistent horizon line through all these paintings as well. So they're constructed in quite a Western conventional way of structuring vision. This was a large in-cut of an earlier pink head that had been done on a white canvas. There's some details you might see, just if you can't pick it up in the image on the left, there's an overlap of 2 heads. There's a head in profile with a head painted in, pardon me, behind that. And the picture on the right, the detail on the right is a stain horizontally poured onto the painting based on a shadow cast from a torso, a skeleton torso. And these came out of 2 drawings, again, from the drawings of Love, Death and Politics. The one on the left was called Claustrophobia, and the one on the right, which is a painting, Oil on Board, was called Mens Rea. So you can see I'm recycling some of these images. It's been very interesting for me, as I said. These were significant images at the time I've done these drawings, and it's been a real pleasure to be able to re-own some of these images and recombine them into paintings. It's as if I don't have to reinvent the wheel. I understand something about these images and where they fit into, if you like, a social or sometimes political sort of context. Here's another painting. Again, not many slides to go. The Refuge Guernsey painting based on really the city of Dimbula. The city of Shepparton, it was. And that's the background. That's an image of Shepparton in the 1920s. Some details. You can see how the surface of the canvas, when it's stretched back out, has a pucker sometimes. And when the person who stretches them puts them together, they have to account for that. And on the right, you can see how the sort of pseudo face of a figure here is cut into and sits on the surface of the painting. Just some other details to show you some of the other painterly approaches, spills, stains, some tonal descriptions on the left, scumbles and so on, and mixes of screen prints. So they're quite active. The surface of these is really varied. And I guess on a certain reading, you know, there is the signifying quality of the image itself, and it's in a negotiation or in a dialogue with the way that that image has been produced. There's not a uniformity to the way that they're produced. They're not all the images and all the painting isn't done by my hand. Here's a more recent painting, Lumpen Harvest painting. It's currently still on the go in my studio at the moment. So this is sort of incomplete. These are the 2 drawings that were partly in behind it. So that drawing on the left, that's actually a drawing I did of a potato when I was an art student. So it's been interesting to pull back into a whole sort of history of graphic images and graphic drawings that one has and to re-own them and to bring them into the present. Here's some details of the surface. You can see the figure has with a tattooing, that's a screen printed tattooing over the body. And you can see the image on the right, the surface in the paintings. And so these details, I guess I'm trying to give you a sense through the screen of what some of the material presence, the aura even of these paintings is like. Just an image to give you a sense of the screens. These screens, my studio happens to be next to a screen printer. And so I work with him, generate the images, and he sets up the screens for me. But I've also had some peers, colleagues at RMIT University who helped me with that, which has been an experience in its own right. I love the mistakes that get produced. In screen printing parlance, they call it freestyling, which is just a word meaning for stuff ups. And this is the final picture I'm going to show you. Again, it's in the studio at the moment, nearly finished. Starfidge morning painting. Starfidge is the name for the incidental figures that exist in landscapes. So some of these paintings, for interest's sake, these actually come from earlier this year, or they were conceived earlier this year when Melbourne was shrouded in a bit of smoke. And what I'm going to do, just before I finish, is take you through some details, again, of the screens. But I did want to take you through the process of this one, and then I'll be finished, David. We can see I'm cutting in. There's the back of the painting, essentially establishing different types of grounds. So these capture a way of thinking and a way that, again, like I alluded right at the beginning to, the recoverability of the process or the history of the painting and how that can communicate to the viewer about the painting itself being a body or a site of coming into being. There's the finished painting. Okay, and I am finished, everyone. I did want to end up on this quote. Kerry James Marshall, the US painter, really significant and important painter, particularly at this time of Black Lives Matter, fantastic painter. And I was really challenged but interested in this quote that he did, it's 10 years ago now. He said, "I gave up on the idea of making art a long time ago," he said, "because I wanted to know how to make paintings." And what an interesting oppositional statement that is, which I don't think it remains true, but for him, it was true at the moment. But then he goes on to say, "But once I came to know that is how to make paintings," he says, "reconsidering the question of what art is returned as a critical issue for his paintings." And I think this is emblematic of some of my thoughts at the moment about now what is the role of painting in a broader political environment and how can it begin to address some of those things. So thank you, David.
Pleasure.
I am finished, and thank you everyone for listening to my talk. And I think I've gone, taking a bit too much time.
No problem.
So
no problem. Can you unshare your screen for us?
Yes.
Yeah, great. And then we've got you back, back where everyone can see you. Firstly, Greg, thank you so much for, for taking us through that. And really, there's a bit more for me to say, really about you, and that is to acknowledge, such a depth of a career, and for so meatilely, consistently interrogating the intersections between the body, politics, and art. Really, really thank you. From for people who don't know Greg, it's not just about the studio practice, it's about artist-run initiatives, it's about a whole range of explorations about what it means to be a contemporary artist in Melbourne, in the world, over many, many years. So thank you.
My pleasure, David. Thank you.
We've got time for one question.
Oh, I'm so sorry, everyone.
No problem. I will actually forward you these questions,
Sure.
Greg, because they really do. I've actually had quite a few messages around this, and I'll make this point. A number of messages have come in that said you've spent a long time describing works without talking about the meaning. Now, don't comment on that just now, because this question sort of comes to the heart of it. Hi, Greg. You briefly mentioned at the start of the talk that you don't fully know what the recent work is about. Can you elaborate on how these works can exist on different levels beyond the studio, and if they also have varied meanings for each viewer? And the golden question, how do you know when a work is finished?
I'll start at the final question. I know when a work is finished. I mean, it's a cliche, but I think artists know that there's a pop on one level, and you go back in and there is a sense. It's partly an aesthetic, it's partly a compositional thing, but it's partly also when all the signifiers, if I use that language, in your work begin to be in a fluid dialogue. So I think that's how I tell, right? There's also another about finished painting. There's also, you look for what's bad. You look for what's not good by your own measure, by what's not working. And that's another technique of knowing. You look for the low elements, the poor elements, and to build them up to what they could be. So there's two attitudes there to what constitutes finish. The first question about the work in the world, reminded me again, David, what's the first question?
You mentioned briefly at the start of the talk that you don't fully know what the recent work is about. Can you elaborate on how these works can exist on different levels beyond the studio, and if they have varied meanings for each viewer?
I don't know what they're about at the moment because I choose not to know. If one of my failings as a young artist it was over-determining meanings and over-injecting set meanings into works. And part of the discussion I've given with you there is about an opening up, mainly through the drawing works, about trying to fully incorporate the, if you like, the agency of the viewer in constructing the meaning of work. That's not a new concept. That's a concept that's been around for 50 years. The experience of the viewer is part of the content of the work, particularly in installation sense, spatialized body material works, but it can close down into actual drawings. I believe that a poetic in a drawing communicates in a certain way, its material basis. And so that's part of that. How can the work have separate meanings? Well, for a long time, I used to think that we do to some extent share commonalities in a community. I'm not sure to what extent we share them across the whole world. I know they're culturally specific and so on and so on. In the deep past, there were common mythological types of iconographies that could be worked. In Renaissance times, 500 years ago and up until recently, there have been theological narratives that could be shared and could be used as the basis for discussions of meaning. And it seems to me that one of the things, ironically, that we may have at the moment now is really about some of our political, ideological understandings. Not that we share them and agree with them, but that we understand them when they're being activated. That's what dog whistling is. But also there's an idea of celebrity. So many of these pictures activate often known figures, elements that we may recognize from society and attempt to bring them together. So I think the viewers, all viewers enter works to the ability that they're able to the context of their understandings and worldview. Underneath that, there are, at the painting level, there are certain formal qualities that structure the way the viewer comes to the work, whether it's spatialized in installation or whether it's within, in this case, the compositional, aesthetic, color, material aspects of painting that can sort of be worked with. And there's one of the things you learn as you get a bit older. But overall, there's also, these are a very tight group of iconographical images. One or two figures, receding space. The first set of images have an exterior element. The second set of images have an interior element. So there is a dialogue there between interior and exterior that's occurring with certain events happening.
Greg, we're going to wind up now, but
Sorry, David.
no, not at all. Please don't apologise. The questions are still coming in. I'll get the chat to you somehow. Yep. But really, Greg, thank you so much for the generosity, for taking the time to select a suite of works that really cut to the heart of, you know, the values and the interests that have been sustained over a very, very long period. And, you know, congratulations again on such a stunning career, and particularly the show that, you know, many of us
the show that wasn't
get to see,
but which will be. So do you want me to look at some of those questions, David?
We'll get that to you, don't worry.
No
we'll
worries.
Get that to you. Yep. To everybody who's joined us from wherever you are, thank you so much for being with us. Our guest speaker next week for Art Forum is Marie Clark, and I look forward to joining you then. Thank you very, very much, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye, everyone.